There is a kind of woman the social world never quite learns to read, not because she is difficult, not because she is strange, but because she is so reliably, quietly there, season after season, event after event, that the eye simply stops registering her the way it stops registering the third candelabra from the left, or the pattern on a wallpaper you have passed 100 times. She does not arrive late to be noticed. She does not laugh at a volume calibrated to carry across a room. She does not position herself near the most powerful man present and wait. She simply comes. She stays. She leaves at a reasonable hour. And no one, not once in 3 years, thinks to ask what she actually thinks about any of it. Lord Percival Greymont, Duke of Aldenmere, had been in the same rooms as Winifred Ashby for 3 consecutive seasons. He could have named every significant family in attendance on any given evening. He could not have told you with any confidence that she had been there at all. This is the story of what happens when a woman who was never seen finally decides to stop showing up, and what that absence does to a man who did not know, until the chair was empty, that he had been looking for her all along. There is a particular kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with being plain or poor or forgettable. It is the invisibility of consistency, of being so reliably present that the eye simply stops registering you, the way it stops registering the wallpaper or the third candelabra from the left. Winifred Ashby had inhabited that invisibility for 3 full seasons without ever choosing it. She arrived at every ball on time, dressed with quiet precision, spoke when spoken to, and moved through rooms that were too bright and too loud with the particular calm of someone who had learned, long ago, not to need applause in order to keep standing. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention at the door. She did not arrive late to be noticed, did not laugh at a volume calibrated to carry, did not position herself near the most powerful man in the room and wait. She simply came. She stayed. She left at a reasonable hour, and season after season, the same faces filled the same rooms, the same conversations moved in the same circles, and no one, not once, in 3 years, had ever thought to ask Miss Winifred Ashby what she actually thought about any of it. Lord Percival Greymont, Duke of Aldenmere, had been in those same rooms for all 3 of those seasons. He had stood near the same fireplaces, accepted the same champagne from the same silver trays, received the same parade of introductions with the same measured courtesy. He could have told you the names of every significant family in attendance on any given evening. He could not have told you with any confidence whether Winifred Ashby had been there at all. Percival Greymont had not always been like this. There had been a time, early, brief, and not something he revisited with any frequency, when rooms had felt like places where something might happen. That time had passed. What replaced it was not unhappiness exactly, but a kind of settled efficiency. He attended what was required, performed what was expected, and returned home without having given or received anything of particular consequence. It was, by every external measure, a successful life. He had simply stopped asking whether success and meaning were the same thing. The women who pursued him were not subtle about it, and he did not blame them for trying. He was a duke, unmarried, not yet 40, and in possession of an estate that the architectural press had described as one of the finest examples of its period in the whole of the county. He understood that these things made him a target in certain social circles, and he navigated that reality with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything else, keeping a precise distance, never encouraging what he did not intend to follow through on, and retiring early enough to avoid the conversations that required something he was no longer sure he had left to give. What he did not understand What he had never stopped to examine was why, in a room full of women who wanted very much to be seen by him, he had never once felt the pull of genuine curiosity. Not about any of them. Not about their inner lives or their actual opinions or the things they cared about when no one was watching. He moved through the social season the way a man moves through furniture in a familiar room, efficiently, without injury, and without ever once wondering what any of it was made of. The first season, Winifred had told herself it was obligation. Her mother had asked. Her aunt had arranged the invitations, and declining would have required an explanation she did not want to give. So she went. She dressed carefully, not to impress, but because she respected herself enough to show up well. She spoke to the people who spoke to her and listened more than she talked, which was not a strategy. It was simply who she was. And somewhere in the middle of the second evening of that first season, she had looked across a ballroom and seen Lord Percival Greymont standing near a window, alone for a moment, reading the room with an expression she could only describe as exhausted precision. And something in her had gone very still. The second season, she had been honest enough with herself to admit that obligation was no longer the whole story. She was not a woman who indulged in fantasy. She knew perfectly well the distance between her position and his, between what she was and what his world required. But there is a difference between pursuing something and simply being unable to stop noticing it, and what she felt every time she entered a room where he might also be present belonged firmly in the second category. She did not engineer proximity. She did not angle for introduction. She simply arrived and noticed and went home with the quiet satisfaction of having at least been in the same room as something that felt, against all practical evidence, worth noticing. By the third season, she had begun to understand that this was becoming dangerous. Not because he had noticed her. He hadn't. Not once. Not in any meaningful way. But because she was starting to build a life around an absence. Around a man who did not know she existed. And Winifred Ashby was far too clear-eyed a woman to let that continue without doing something about it. The evening of Lady Farr's winter dinner, second season February, a room smelling of pine and candle wax. Winifred had been seated 4 places down from Lord Greymont at a table of 14. She had watched him navigate a conversation about land reform with a precision and fairness that surprised her, given what she had expected from a man of his position. At one point, he had made a quiet observation that cut through a great deal of fashionable noise and landed on the most honest version of the problem. No one else at the table had seemed to notice. She had. She had almost said so, had felt the words forming, and then the conversation had moved on, and the moment had closed, and he had not looked in her direction once for the remainder of the evening. There was the night at the Caldwell Music Hall when the soprano had gone slightly sharp on the third movement, and the entire room had made the collective social decision to pretend otherwise. Winifred had glanced toward the Duke, not intending to share anything, simply because her eyes had moved that direction, and found him looking at the ceiling with an expression of such precisely controlled diplomacy that she had nearly laughed. She had pressed her lips together instead. He had not seen her almost laugh. He had already looked away. There were other moments. Small ones. A dropped program she had retrieved from near his feet at the Harwich Assembly and placed on the chair beside him without speaking, because he had been mid-conversation and interruption would have been rude. A night when she had heard someone say something unkind about his late father. The kind of thing said in the cruelty of social confidence, and she had redirected the conversation with such quiet efficiency that the speaker had not even realized what had happened. He had not been in earshot. He had not known. None of it had registered, because none of it had been visible, and Winifred had never once performed a kindness for an audience. It was the Aldenmere autumn ball, his ball, as it happened, held at his estate, which she had attended on the strength of Lady Ottoline Fair's invitation, and the private, unexamined hope that a man was different on his own ground. The house was extraordinary, not showy in the way of houses that are trying to prove something, but genuinely, structurally beautiful in a way that suggested generations of people who had cared about it, about the light that came through the east windows in the morning, about the proportion of the staircase, about the roses trained along the south wall with the patience of someone who understood that some things only become beautiful slowly. Winifred had stood in the entrance hall for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, simply because the house felt like a sentence she had not expected to be moved by. She had seen him twice that evening. The first time across the main room, surrounded, as always, by people who wanted something from him, navigating it all with his customary competence and his customary distance. The second time had been different. She had stepped out onto the terrace for air, and he had been there, alone, standing at the balustrade with a glass of wine he did not appear to be drinking, looking out at the darkened garden with the expression of a man who had forgotten, for one unguarded moment, to perform composure. He had not heard her come out. She had stood very still, and for approximately 40 seconds, she had counted, without meaning to. She had seen something in him that she had never seen from across a ballroom, something that was not duty or distance or efficiency, something that simply was. She had gone back inside before he turned. She had found Lady Ottoline, made her excuses, and gone home earlier than she had planned. In the carriage, in the dark, with the city moving past the window, she had made a decision she did not articulate fully to herself until several days later. That she was building something inside herself around a man who did not know she existed, and that if she was not careful, it would eventually cost her more than any number of social seasons was worth. The third season had ended. She would not attend the fourth. She had made her decision. No letter, no farewell, no scene, just a neat stack of unopened invitations on the corner of a writing desk, and a woman who had spent 3 years being invisible in other people's rooms, finally choosing to be present in her own life. The fourth season was about to begin. 200 events. The same faces. The same music. The same champagne on the same silver trays. And for the first time in 3 years, Winifred Ashby would not be there. What no one had calculated, least of all the man who had never once thought to look for her, was what an absence can do to a room that never knew it needed a presence. He was about to find out. She did not announce it. That was the thing that Lady Ottoline Farr would later say she found most characteristic. Not the decision itself, but the absolute absence of drama surrounding it. There was no letter to anyone explaining her reasoning, no conversation with her mother that began with, "I have been thinking," no visible preparation, no farewell to a life she was stepping away from. Winifred Ashby simply did not send back the acceptance cards for the fourth season. She let the invitations accumulate on the corner of her writing desk for 3 days, read each one with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and then set them aside in a neat stack that meant, without requiring any further explanation, that she was done. What she felt in the days that followed was not relief exactly, and not grief either. It was something closer to the particular quiet that settles into a room after a window has been closed, against a wind you had grown so accustomed to that you had stopped noticing it was there. She had spent 3 years moving through spaces that were not built for her, performing a version of herself that was socially acceptable and emotionally hollow, and allowing, without ever fully admitting it, the faint and structurally unsound hope that one specific man might one day simply look up. She was finished with that, not bitterly, not dramatically, Simply finished, the way a woman finishes a book that was well written, but not, in the end, for her. She filled the evenings she would have spent at balls with other things. She read more. She visited her aunt in the country for a fortnight, and found she had been genuinely missing the quiet of it. She accepted an invitation from Lady Adeline to assist with the organization of a lecture series. History, architecture, the kind of intellectual work that had always interested her more than champagne and introductions. The fourth season opened without her. The rooms filled, the candles burned, the music played, and somewhere in the city, Winifred Ashby sat by a fire with a book and felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely like herself. The Harwich Assembly opened the fourth season on a Thursday in October, which was where it had always opened, with the same flowers and the same orchestra and the same reliable cast of faces that constituted the social world Percival Greymont had been moving through for the better part of a decade. He arrived at 9:20, which was when he always arrived, late enough to avoid the opening formalities, early enough to fulfill the obligation without appearing to have timed it. He accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray. He nodded to Lord Fentham. He exchanged 3 sentences with Lady Caldwell about her recent travels. And then, without meaning to, without understanding why, he scanned the room. It was something he did at every event, a habit of assessment, a quick inventory of who was present and what the evening required of him socially. He moved his gaze across the room in the way he always did, left to right, noting faces, registering names, filing information. He completed the survey. He lifted his glass, and then, 6 seconds later, he did it again, slower this time, without knowing why he was doing it, stopping on faces he had already registered and moving past them, and stopping again, as though he were looking for something specific that he could not name. He found everything he expected to find. He did not find what he was looking for. He was not even certain, standing there with the music starting and the room settling into its familiar rhythms, that he knew what he had been looking for at all. He stayed until 11, which was later than he usually stayed. He told himself it was because Lord Fentham had wanted to discuss a matter of county business. Lord Fentham had, in fact, been ready to leave at 10:30. Percival had been the one to extend the conversation, twice with questions that were not urgent. He did not examine this on the carriage ride home. He looked out the window at the passing streets and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him, and arrived home with the faint, structureless sense of having misplaced something he had not known he was carrying. It was Lady Adeline Fair who first said it aloud, which surprised no one who knew her. She was a woman of considerable social intelligence, and very little patience for the pretense that observation was the same thing as interference. And she had noticed Winifred's absence from the first evening of the season with an attention that was equal parts affection and curiosity. By the third event, she had begun to notice something else, a certain restlessness in Lord Greymont that had not been there before. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone who hadn't been watching him for years, but there, in the way his gaze moved across rooms, with a quality of searching that his customary efficiency did not explain. She mentioned it to her husband on the carriage ride home from the Pemberton dinner, which was the fourth social event of the season, and the fourth at which Winifred had not appeared. "He keeps looking for something," she said. Her husband, who had learned over 17 years of marriage that his wife's social observations were rarely wrong, asked what she thought he was looking for. "I'm not entirely sure he knows," she said, and left it there. Because some things are more useful as questions than as answers. The broader social world was less precise in its observations, but not entirely blind. Several people remarked, in the mild conversational way of people who are not deeply invested, but do notice patterns, that Miss Ashby had not been seen this season. A few wondered aloud whether she was unwell. One woman, Mrs. Holt, who catalogued absences the way other people catalogued receipts, mentioned it within earshot of Lord Greymont at the Whitmore card evening, saying simply that it was unusual, that Miss Ashby had been such a reliable fixture, that one did hope nothing was wrong. Percival had been mid-sentence when she said it. He finished his sentence. He did not visibly react. But Lady Ottoline, standing 12 feet away and paying attention, watched him go very still for just a moment. The particular stillness of a man whose mind has just snagged on something and is trying, with imperfect success, to pull itself free. The fifth event of the season was a musical evening at Viscount Pembury's townhouse, the kind of gathering Percival attended out of habit rather than interest, arriving with no particular expectation and leaving with the same. He arrived. He greeted the necessary people. He found a position near the back of the room where he could listen to the performance without being required to discuss it afterward, which was his preferred arrangement for musical events. He listened. The music was competent. The room was warm. And at some point during the second piece, a quiet, precise piece for strings that required actual attention to follow, he became aware that he was watching the door. Not obviously. Not in a way anyone would have noticed. But he was aware of it the way you become aware of a sound you cannot place. A low, persistent attention that your mind keeps returning to without your permission. Each time the door opened to admit a late arrival, his eyes moved. Each time the arrival was someone he recognized, someone unremarkable, someone who was not her. He did not, at this point, allow himself to finish the thought with a name. But the thought was there, incomplete and inconvenient, and it did not resolve itself by the end of the evening. The sixth event was a dinner at the Ashworths, 14 guests seated, the kind of occasion where absence is visible in a way that a crowded ballroom does not permit. There was a chair to his left that remained empty throughout the meal. A late cancellation, Mrs. Ashworth explained with mild irritation, and Percival spent more time than was reasonable being aware of that empty chair. Not because he had expected Winifred to be in it. He hadn't, but emptiness, he was beginning to understand, had started to carry a particular texture that it had not carried before, and he was not yet willing to examine what that meant. It was Bastian Wycliffe who said it, which made it worse somehow, though Percival could not have explained why it should matter who said a name. Wycliffe was a perfectly agreeable man, younger than Percival by several years, well regarded in legal circles, possessed of an easy social confidence that made him welcome in most rooms. He had been speaking to Lord Fentham at the edge of the Caldwell drawing-room when Percival drifted within earshot, and the conversation had been unremarkable until Wycliffe said, with the particular warmth of a man describing something that has genuinely pleased him, "I had the good fortune of Miss Ashby's company at the lecture hall last Tuesday. Remarkable woman. The kind of mind that makes you reconsider every assumption you walked in with." Percival did not stop walking. He continued past at the same pace, and positioned himself near the window with his glass and his back to the room, which was a thing he did sometimes when he needed a moment of privacy in a public space. The conversation behind him continued. Fentham said something about the lecture series. Wycliffe responded with an enthusiasm that was clearly genuine, and Percival stood at the window and looked out at the dark street below, and felt something move through him that he had no immediate category for. It was not jealousy. He was certain of that, because jealousy required a prior claim, and he had none. It was not concern, because Wycliffe was a decent man, and there was nothing concerning about a decent man finding a woman remarkable. What it was, stripped of every comfortable explanation he attempted to put around it, was this: the sudden, unwelcome and entirely clarifying recognition that someone else had been paying attention. That while he had been moving through 3 seasons of the same rooms with the same efficient distance, someone else had stopped, had looked, had listened, had found, in a woman Percival had never once thought to look at directly, something worth calling remarkable. And the part that refused to leave him alone as he stood at that window, the part that followed him home and sat with him in the silence of his study long after the evening was over, was the simple, irrefutable fact that he could not say, with any confidence, that Wycliffe was wrong. The lecture series met every Tuesday at a hall on Beckford Street, a narrow building with good acoustics and terrible heating that Winifred had come to love with the particular affection one develops for places that ask nothing of you except attention. She had been helping Lady Ottoline organize the program since September, corresponding with speakers, managing the room arrangements, preparing the printed summaries that were distributed at the door. It was unglamorous work in the way that most genuinely useful work is unglamorous, and she found it deeply satisfying in a way that 3 seasons of carefully choreographed social performance had never once managed to be. She was not unhappy. That was the thing she wanted to be honest with herself about, because there was a version of this story, the version in which a woman withdraws from society because she is heartbroken and spends her absence pining, that she refused to inhabit. She was not pining. She had made a clear-eyed decision, and she was living inside it with her full attention, and the life she was building in the space the social season had previously occupied was quieter and smaller and more genuinely hers than anything she had managed in the 3 years before. She read. She worked. She had dinner with Lady Ottoline on Thursdays and argued about history and drank wine that was slightly too expensive for either of their budgets, and went home feeling, reliably, like a full person. What she did not do was think about Lord Percival Greymont with any regularity. Or so she told herself, with the firm and slightly effortful conviction of a woman who has decided that a thing is true and intends to keep deciding it until it becomes so. There were moments, a certain quality of evening light, a piece of music heard through a window, a phrase in a book that landed with the particular precision of something she would have wanted to share, when the thought arrived uninvited and she acknowledged it with the same calm she brought to everything and then set it aside. She was good at setting things aside. She had been practicing for 3 years. He went back through the seasons the way a man goes back through accounts when something does not add up, methodically, without wanting to find what he was looking for, but unable to stop looking. The Harwich Assembly, 1st season. Had she been there? He believed so. A woman near the east wall, quiet, dark dress, not someone who had been introduced to him. The Caldwell dinner, 2nd season. 14 at the table. He could recall 11 faces with confidence. The remaining 3 were softer in memory, and one of them, he was now fairly certain, had been positioned 4 seats to his left and had said something at some point that he had not registered at the time, but that now, infuriatingly, he could not reconstruct. The Aldenmere Autumn Ball. His own estate. He had hosted 200 people and spoken to perhaps 30 of them with any real attention, and the rest had moved through his house like weather, present, then gone, leaving no particular trace. He tried to find her in the memory of that evening and could not place her precisely, which was its own kind of information. Someone had been on his terrace. He had a vague sense of a presence, not intrusive, not announcing itself, simply there for a moment and then not. But he could not sharpen it into a face or a name or anything more than the ghost of an impression. The idea that she had been there, in his own house, and he had not known, had not looked, had not thought to look, sat with him in a way he found difficult to move past. What troubled him most was not the specific memories, but the pattern they formed when laid against each other. 3 seasons, dozens of events, a woman who had been, by all available evidence, consistently present, and consistently, entirely invisible to him. Not because she was invisible, because he had not looked. There is a particular kind of shame available only to people who are honest enough to assign it correctly, and Percival Greymont, standing in his library on a Tuesday evening with no good reason to be thinking about this, and every reason to stop, was discovering that he was, apparently, that kind of person. He did not plan it, which was unusual for him, because he planned most things. What happened was this. Lady Adeline mentioned the lecture series at the Whitmore gathering in November, mentioned it directly to him, which in retrospect he recognized as not entirely accidental, and said that the following Tuesday's speaker was a historian of some considerable reputation, and that the program had been largely organized by Miss Ashby, whose eye for intellectual rigor was, Lady Adeline said, with a particular emphasis that Percival chose not to examine, rather remarkable. He nodded. He said something polite. He went home and spent the better part of an hour not thinking about Tuesday. He arrived at the hall on Beckford Street at 7:30, which was 5 minutes before the program began, wearing a coat that was neither his most formal nor his most casual, a choice he had made 3 times before settling on it, which was also unusual. The hall was perhaps 60 people, arranged on plain wooden chairs, the kind of gathering that had nothing to do with titles or positioning or the elaborate social arithmetic of the season. He found a seat near the back. He did not announce himself. 2 women near the front were distributing printed programs, and one of them, moving efficiently between the rows with a stack of papers and her attention directed entirely at the task, was Winifred Ashby. She did not see him immediately. He had perhaps 90 seconds of watching her work before she turned in his direction. And in those 90 seconds he understood something he had been circling for weeks without landing on. She was completely herself here. Not performing, not navigating, not managing the impression she made on a room full of people whose opinions carried social consequence. She was simply a woman doing work she cared about in a place that suited her. And the ease of it, the absolute unforced ease of her in that environment, was so different from every context in which he had previously failed to notice her that he felt, with some discomfort, that he was seeing her for the first time. When she turned and found him sitting in the 4th row from the back, her expression moved through something brief and unreadable before settling into a composure that was, he now recognized, not the same thing as warmth. She greeted him the way she would have greeted any unexpected attendee, correctly, without coldness, and without a single degree more warmth than the situation required. "Lord Greymont, I didn't know you had an interest in the period." It was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It was also, delivered in that tone, a very precise way of saying, "You are not expected here, and I have no particular feelings about your presence." He said that he had developed an interest recently, which was true in more ways than he intended to convey. She handed him a program. The lecture began. He stayed for the discussion period afterward, which he had not planned to do. Several people gathered near the front to speak with the historian, and Winifred moved among them with the easy competence of someone managing an event she understood entirely, directing conversations, answering questions, ensuring the speaker had what he needed. Percival positioned himself at a reasonable distance and waited for a natural opening, which did not come, because Winifred was either genuinely occupied or very good at being genuinely occupied, and the distinction was impossible to determine from the outside. When the room began to empty, she approached him with the same correct pleasantness and asked if he had found the lecture useful. He said he had found it considerably more than useful. She said she was glad to hear it. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained, on her side, absolutely nothing he could read. He tried twice more in the days that followed. Once at Lady Oteline's Thursday dinner, to which he had not previously been a regular attendee, and to which he arrived with an explanation about passing through the neighborhood that convinced no one, least of all himself. Once at the lecture hall the following Tuesday, where he sat in the same seat, and she greeted him with the same correct pleasantness and the same precise emotional distance. She was not unkind. She was not cold. She was simply not open, and Percival, who had spent a decade being the person in rooms who was not open, found that being on the receiving end of it was an experience for which nothing in his life had adequately prepared him. It happened on the third Tuesday, during the discussion period, after a lecture on the correspondence of a 19th-century architect, whose work Winifred had evidently spent considerable time with. The historian had made a claim that Percival thought was defensible but incomplete, and without entirely meaning to, he said so, quietly, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man thinking aloud rather than performing an opinion. Winifred, who had been standing 4 feet away with her back partially toward him, turned. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, not the correct pleasantness, not the managed distance, something that was quicker than either of those things, a flash of genuine interest, the kind that arrives before the mind has time to decide whether to allow it. And that was gone almost immediately, replaced by the composure she had clearly decided was the appropriate register for his presence. But it had been there. He had seen it. And she knew, from the quality of the silence that followed, that he had seen it. She covered it well. She turned the conversation toward the historian's response, asked a question that was genuinely incisive and that moved the room's attention away from the two of them with elegant efficiency. But something had shifted, and they both felt it. The way the air in a room changes when a window is opened that has been closed for a long time. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a change in pressure, subtle and unmistakable, that told anyone paying attention that something had moved that could not entirely be moved back. Percival said nothing. He simply stayed until the hall was nearly empty, and when she finally looked at him directly, without the correct pleasantness, without the managed distance, just a straight, clear look that lasted slightly longer than it needed to, he understood that the conversation they had both been not having was going to have to be had. Something had moved. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a shift, the way air shifts when a window is opened that has been closed for a long time. She had not meant to let him see it. He had not meant to look at exactly the right moment. But he had seen it, and she knew he had seen it. 3 seasons of careful invisibility, 4 months of equally careful distance. And now, in a lecture hall on Beckford Street, with the room emptying around them and neither of them moving toward the door, the conversation they had both been not having was finally going to have to be had. The question was no longer whether he had noticed her. The question was whether she was going to let that matter. He went home after that third Tuesday and sat in his library for a long time without lighting additional lamps, which was something he did not normally do. He was, by nature and by habit, a man who preferred full light, who found the practical comfort of visibility more useful than the atmospheric comfort of shadow. But that evening, he sat in the diminishing light and did something he had been avoiding with considerable skill for the better part of 2 months. He thought about it directly, not circling, not approaching from angles, directly. 3 seasons, dozens of rooms, a woman who had been present, consistently and without performance, in every significant social space he had occupied for 3 years. A woman who had, by the evidence now accumulating in his memory, with the uncomfortable precision of a case being built against him, demonstrated more genuine intelligence, more quiet integrity, more of the specific quality of attention that he had always privately valued above every social grace. Demonstrated all of it, repeatedly, in his immediate vicinity, and received in return not a single moment of his genuine notice. He had looked past her, through her, around her. Not from cruelty, he was honest enough to know the difference, but from a habit of non-attention so deeply ingrained that it had functioned, in practice, as cruelty anyway. The effect, as Winifred Ashby had clearly understood, long before he did, was identical. What he felt sitting in that dimming library was not guilt in the dramatic sense, not the sharp, performable guilt of a man who has done something obviously wrong and wants to be absolved of it. It was something quieter and more structurally damaging than that. It was the recognition that he had been, for 3 years, exactly the kind of person he most privately despised. Someone who moved through the world taking inventory of everything useful and registering nothing real. Someone who had been given, repeatedly and without fanfare, the opportunity to see something worth seeing, and had chosen, every single time, the easier work of not looking. That was not a thing he could apologize his way out of. It was a thing he was going to have to do something about. She had known the conversation was coming. She had known it from the moment their eyes had held that fraction too long in the lecture hall, from the quality of his silence on the carriage steps when she had said goodnight, from the way Lady Adeline had been conspicuously failing to mention his name with the studied casualness of someone who was thinking about it constantly. Winifred had spent the intervening days being honest with herself, which was, as always, the work she found both most necessary and most uncomfortable. And what the honesty produced was this: she was not indifferent to him. She had never been indifferent to him, but indifference and willingness were not the same thing. And what she was not willing to do was allow 3 seasons of invisibility to be quietly rewritten as a charming prologue to his interest. When he came, on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not a lecture day, which meant he had come specifically and without the cover of a scheduled event, she received him in the sitting room with the door open and Lady Adeline conveniently present in the next room, because she was a practical woman, and she saw no reason to make any of this easier than it needed to be. He sat across from her and began, with the particular carefulness of a man choosing words that he knows are insufficient, to say something about having been wrong. She let him get most of the way through it before she spoke. What she said was not cruel, and it was not a speech, and it did not have the shape of something she had rehearsed. It was simply true, said in the quiet, direct way she said everything, that she had attended those events for 3 years and had been in the same rooms as him, and had, at various points, been 4 seats away at dinner and on his own terrace in the dark, and within arm's reach on a dozen other occasions that she did not enumerate, and that not once in any of it had he looked at her as though she were someone worth the effort of an introduction. She was not saying this to wound him. She was saying it because she needed him to understand the specific shape of what had happened before either of them could have any honest conversation about what might come after. He did not argue with her. That was the first thing, the thing she had not entirely expected, because men of his position and his particular kind of pride were not, in her experience, naturally inclined toward sitting quietly inside an accurate indictment of their own behavior. He sat with what she had said the way you sit with something heavy, not trying to put it down, not trying to redistribute the weight, just holding it and letting it be what it was. And then he said, simply, that she was right. Not as a strategy, not as the opening move of a persuasion. As a fact he had arrived at himself, and was not going to insult her by dressing up as something more complicated. What followed was not a declaration. It was attendance. He came back to the lecture hall the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. Not hovering, not pressing, not engineering proximity with the transparent ambition of a man running a campaign. He simply continued to show up in the spaces where she was, and to be, in those spaces, genuinely present in a way that was different from every prior version of himself she had observed from a distance. He asked questions that were real questions. He listened to her answers with the full weight of his attention, which was, she was discovering, a considerable thing when it was actually directed at you rather than past you. He did not perform interest. He had interest, and it showed in the specific way he followed the thread of what she said, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He also, on a Thursday in December, appeared at Lady Adeline's dinner without any new explanation, and sat at the far end of the table from Winifred, and spent the entire evening not looking at her with a discipline that was so visible it made Lady Adeline press her lips together over her wine-glass to avoid smiling. He had brought a book that the historian had mentioned, a specific text she had said she wanted to read and had not yet found, and left it on the hall table when he departed without making anything of it. Without attaching a note, without converting a quiet gesture into a performance, by requiring her to acknowledge it in front of witnesses, she found it on her way out. She stood in Lady Adeline's hallway for a moment with the book in her hands and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately name, but that she recognized, with the clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything, as something she had been trying for quite some time not to feel. It was not a dramatic moment. She wanted to be accurate about that, afterward. Wanted to be honest about the fact that it was not a single scene with a particular quality of light and a memorable exchange of words, but something smaller and more structurally honest than that. It was a Tuesday in January, cold enough that the hall on Beckford Street had finally been given adequate heating, and the lecture had been on correspondence. Letters between people who were separated by distance and time, and the particular difficulty of saying true things clearly. Winifred had listened with more personal attention than was strictly academic. Percival had sat 2 rows behind her and slightly to the left, which was where he had been sitting for 6 consecutive weeks, and she had been aware of him the way you are aware of a source of warmth in a cold room. Not distractingly, but constantly, underneath everything else. Afterward, when the room had mostly emptied and she was collecting the remaining programs from the chairs, he had helped without being asked. Not as a gesture, not picking up one program with the deliberate meaningfulness of a man making a point, but practically. Moving through the rows on the other side of the room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to the task herself, as though it had simply not occurred to him to stand and watch while she worked. They had finished at approximately the same moment and met near the door with a small stack of papers each, and he had looked at her, directly, without the careful management he had used in the early weeks. Just looked, and said that he had been thinking about the question the historian had raised about honesty in correspondence, about whether it was easier to be true in writing than in person, about whether the distance made the truth more possible or just more comfortable. She had looked back at him and understood, with the sudden, clear simplicity of something that had always been true and had finally stopped being obscured, that she was not going to be able to keep deciding, on a weekly basis, that she did not feel what she felt. It was not surrender. It was not weakness. It was the specific courage required to stop protecting yourself from something that is not, in the end, going to hurt you, and to know the difference between that and the things that will. She set the programs down on the table by the door. She said, in a tone that was quieter than her usual and entirely her own. I think it is easier in writing, but I think the things said in person are the ones that actually count. He had been very still when she said it, and she had not looked away. The evening was not a ball. It was not a formal event of any kind. Not the kind of setting that the social world would have considered appropriate for anything significant to occur between a duke and a woman of no particular title or fortune. It was a Thursday in February, late, the lecture series having concluded for the season, and the small group that had formed around it, Winifred, Lady Adeline, the historian, 2 or 3 others who had become regulars, had gathered at Lady Adeline's house for supper, and the particular, pleasurable disorder of people who have been thinking about the same things for several months and no longer need to be careful with each other. Percival had been included without ceremony, which was itself a kind of statement. He and Winifred had ended up on the window seat of Adeline's back sitting room sometime after 10, separated from the main conversation by the natural drift of an evening where no one was managing impressions. The window looked out onto a garden that was bare and frost-edged in the February dark, and the room behind them was warm with voices and lamplight, and there was no social architecture around what they said to each other. No positioning, no performance, no careful management of what it might mean for anyone watching. He told her, without preamble and without the elaborate scaffolding of a rehearsed declaration, that what he had found in the last 4 months, in the lecture hall, in the conversations, in the simple and continually surprising experience of being in a room with someone who said what she actually thought, was something he had stopped believing was available to him. That he was not asking her to forget 3 seasons of his own inattention, that he was asking, with the full understanding, that she was not obliged to give him anything, whether she might be willing to let this, whatever this was, be something. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the frost garden held its cold patience, and the voices in the room behind them continued their warm, unhurried work. And Winifred Ashby looked at the man across from her, not the Duke, not the title, not the figure she had watched from a careful distance for 3 years, and saw, with the precision she brought to everything she actually looked at, that he was telling the truth. Not the polished truth of a man who has learned what to say. The unpolished, slightly uncomfortable truth of a man who has understood something about himself that he did not previously know, and is not certain what to do with it, except offer it honestly. She had spent 3 seasons invisible to him. She had spent 4 months deciding whether the person who had finally looked was someone she could trust with what she had always actually felt. She had her answer. She said, in the quiet, direct way she said everything that mattered. Then let's find out what it is. It was not a grand ending. It was something better than that. A beginning made by 2 people who had, each in their own way and at considerable personal cost, finally stopped pretending.